here with you and have the privilege today of introducing plenary speaker Nicholas Sooy. So Nicholas Sooy is the Managing Director of the North American Orthodox Peace Fellowship. That's a community of Orthodox Christian peacemakers focused on peace research and peace building among religious communities. He serves also as the editor of In Communion, which is the journal of the Orthodox Peace Fellowship. And he teaches in the philosophy department at Fordham University, where he also researches the underpinnings of public and social phenomena such as conflicts, markets, and collective behavior. The Orthodox Peace Fellowship was originally founded by Orthodox seminarians during the Vietnam War. It was reinvigorated under the leadership of Jim Forrest, who was a mentee of Dorothy Day and Thich Nhat Hanh. For decades, the organization has highlighted issues of militarization, nuclear disarmament, and conscientious objection from an Orthodox Christian perspective and for that audience. Since the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the Orthodox Peace Fellowship has partnered with peacemaker priests inside Russia and inside Ukraine, raising funds for their work and bringing their voices to Western audiences. In my work with the Fellowship, Fellowship for Reconciliation, which is known as FOR USA, the nation's oldest, largest interfaith peace and justice organization, of which Nobel laureates Jane Addams and the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. were members, I had the privilege of meeting Nick, only virtually at that time, so it's great to meet you in person today, Nick, to discuss how FOR USA could support the work of the Orthodox Peace Fellowship in their efforts to help those committed to faith-based peacemaking in Russia and Ukraine. So, it's my distinct pleasure to introduce Mr. Sooy to share with us his reflections and insights today on spiritual practices of peace and resistance in Ukraine.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. Just a brief warning, there will be a very short mention of some of the atrocities that have occurred in Ukraine. I'm going to start with a little bit of background. So I work for the Orthodox Peace Fellowship, and you might know that 70% of Russians and 70% of Ukrainians are Orthodox Christians. So we've got members of our church on both sides here. As another bit of background, if you ask Ukrainians when the war began, they will say, not last year, but 2014, when Russia annexed Crimea and invaded eastern Ukraine. I first became involved in peace efforts in the country in 2017, as part of my work for my organization. And in 2018, I made a trip to Kiev here to meet with some of my colleagues, to meet with priests, peace activists, who were in a little working group to strategize. And I saw, this picture doesn't quite do it justice, the most beautiful sunset I've ever seen in my life. Ukraine is such a beautiful country, and Kiev is such a beautiful city. Where we're standing is called Independence Square, better known as Maidan. Maidan was the site of two revolutions, two nonviolent revolutions in Ukraine. First in 2004, when Viktor Yanukovych was prevented from taking the presidency, and again in 2013, 2014, when Viktor Yanukovych was finally ousted from the presidency. Starting in the winter of 2013, many Ukrainians flooded this square. You can see it here, the beautiful architecture, in order to protest the Russian alignment of Yanukovych and his government, and held what they called the Revolution of Dignity. One of my colleagues was a priest, Father Mikhailo Dimin, who spent that long winter in Maidan as a chaplain. And he told me that these protests created a palpable sense of unity for Ukrainians. That the feeling in Maidan was the feeling one gets in the divine liturgy, the Eucharistic service. In a very, very literal sense, this resistance of the Ukrainian people to Russian subjugation was liturgical. The word liturgy comes from lay, the word laity, and the word work, leiturgos, the work of the people. And that's precisely what happened. With the participation of many priests, people in Maidan went to work. However, it was not easy. Toward the end of the protest, government forces had killed more than 100 civilians. And Father Mikhailo recounted hearing the confessions of young men who were going to march against the government, believing they were about to die, so they sought out the comfort of a priest. For their part, the church did all they could to support these protests. You can see here. Priests taking the front lines and monks. They're canonically forbidden from carrying weapons, but they carried crosses or shields. Placing themselves in between the protesters and those carrying weapons. Praying, hearing confessions, as Father Mikhailo did. And people themselves carried icons and prayed for their right. As Father Mikhailo said, they were praying for the right to die as Ukrainians, to die as free Ukrainians. In another incident, after midnight on December 11th, 2013, government forces rushed the square and attempted to finally clear it out. And a young seminarian, Ivan Sidov, pictured here, he's standing in front of St. Michael's Monastery. He went up into the bell tower of this monastery and started ringing the bells, an alarm, which alerted the protesters, and they were able to hold on to the square. The first time that this church ever rang its bells during the nighttime was in the year 1240, when the Mongols invaded. I'm not going to continue talking about Maidan, but this gives you a sense of where it all started. Shortly after the victory at Maidan, Russia annexed Crimea, and then several months later sent their little green men into Donbass. And then, of course, last year, Russia launched its full-scale invasion. In the weeks leading up to the invasion, my organization was doing all we could to raise its alarm. And this personally had quite an effect on me. I started having nightmares. You see, other than the sunset, which is beautiful, the other thing which impressed me about Kiev were its subways. So I live in New York City, and our subways don't look like this. You can see the chandeliers. I don't know if you can see in this image, but under those little arches, there are religious icons of saints. And religious imagery just saturates all of Kiev. But for weeks I had these nightmares, people crowding into these beautiful chandelier-lit subway halls. And the image of these people in terror, fleeing these bombs in such a beautiful surrounding kept me up at night. And unfortunately, my nightmares came true. But something happened that I didn't expect. Shortly after the invasion, stories began flooding social media of Ukrainian perseverance. And that's what I want to talk to you about today. I saw videos of people singing and dancing in those cavernous subway halls as they sheltered beneath the bombs. You can see that one's got a guitar there. Very happy couple. Just last December, there was another bomb raid in Kiev. And people once again gathered in these subways. But because it was Christmas season, this is what they were wearing. And here they are singing Orthodox Christmas carols while air raid sirens go off in the background. Now, not all areas of Ukraine fared as well as Kiev, which is largely escaped occupation. With Russian soldiers occupying many areas in the north, or sorry, the east and the south. However, even in these areas, ordinary Ukrainians have resisted, and the church has supported them. I want to tell you now about the town of Sooy. Here's an image that I'm going to explain. So in Sooy, the Russians invaded and they defeated the Ukrainian military who had to flee. They rolled in and occupied the town. And immediately people started holding protests, nonviolent protests across the city. These went on for days until the Russians turned against them and killed 3 civilians. Shortly after this, Father Ivan Shapita, pictured here, took the stage, and this is a picture from him taking the stage in Seton. First he took communion, which, much like in Catholicism, one takes communion before one dies. And he dressed himself in his white vestments, and he took the stage, and this is what he said. He turned directly to the Russian soldiers and said, "You heathens, take off your crosses, for Christians do not point guns at innocent people." And they began threatening him. And he replied that he had already taken communion, and so he was with God and not afraid of death. And if they killed him, they could not kill God. He concluded by saying that he was already dressed in his white vestments, so that when he died, they wouldn't have to change his body to bury him. The soldiers backed down. Shortly after, the mayor of the town approached the soldiers and said that they had no weapons, no military personnel in the town, and that he would arrange a search of the town to verify this if the Russians agreed to leave. So he arranged the search. They found nothing, and the Russians withdrew from the area. The town was spared. Across Ukraine, similar scenes have played out, with people and priests taking to the streets in occupied territories. In a village 25 miles west of Kiev, Father Rostislav Dudarenko, pictured here, was assisting with the civilian-run checkpoint at the entrance to their village when Russian forces came upon them with 3 tanks and began shooting at the checkpoint. Father Rostislav attempted what many priests did during the Maidan protests. He took his cross, he held it high over his head, and he went into the road in front of the tanks and began approaching the Russians in an attempt to appeal to their crimson conscience. He was shot dead. Those who knew Father Rostislav reported that he was a kind and a hopeful soul, and they were unsurprised that he would attempt to reason with their invaders. The village survived, but only because reinforcements from the military soon came along. Another tragic case occurred just last November in Russian-occupied Berdyansk. 2 priests, Father Ivan Levtisky, who's over on that side, and Father Bogdan Kaleta, on my side, had participated in civilian protests against this occupation until the Russians banned the protests. These priests did not listen to the ban and went daily to the town square to pray for peace. These priests reportedly anchored the community, offering comfort to the suffering, distributing food, visiting those in need, and praying continually and publicly for peace. Eventually, the occupiers decided to put an end to this, and looking for some pretext to arrest these 2 priests, they searched the church while they were away, and they found a book of sermons by Metropolitan Andrei Sheptitsky. Metropolitan Andrei is a banned author in Russia. So this book of sermons in a church was enough to arrest these priests. Now, Metropolitan Andrei was an outspoken bishop who was one of the only bishops to speak out against the Holocaust while under Nazi occupation. He personally harbored hundreds of Jews and issued a pastoral letter condemning the Nazis titled, "Thou shalt not kill." It's perhaps no surprise that the Russians wanted to ban such a book. Since their arrest, Father Ivan and Father Bogdan have not been seen in their condition of living. So what's the through line of all of this? This talk is titled Spiritual Practices of Peace and Resistance. So what are these spiritual practices? Well, despite the dramatic bravery, much of what I've described is very ordinary. A priest hearing confession, which is only extraordinary because it's a Maidan. A seminarian ringing bells, this happens all the time. A priest wearing white vestments and taking communion. 2 priests praying for peace. These practices are very ordinary. What's extraordinary about all of this is that Ukrainians have kept on with their faith in the context of such unspeakable horrors. In a war zone, even the simplest acts are heroic. Singing, dancing in the subway, praying in town square, comforting one's friends. Here's a priest doing something that every priest does every week, celebrating the Eucharist. It's only extraordinary because this isn't a bomb shelter. Here's a priest celebrating a funeral, something very ordinary. It's only remarkable because these are a portion of the several hundred unnamed victims of the Boot Show massacre. And here's a priest blessing loaves before Easter, something that happens every year in Orthodox country. Only remarkable because these are soldiers of the front line. In war, everything is harder. Just last month, I was sitting with a friend of mine who's a Ukrainian peace activist. And she told me that she's dissatisfied at all the talk of war trauma. Because people who don't live in war zones don't understand that there's a lot more to war trauma than witnessing your city being bombed and your friends killed. It's everything else. Waking up every day is hard. Praying is hard. And God forbid if you already have difficulties in your life, if you're trapped in a bad relationship, if your parents are old and sick, if you have childhood trauma, this is all so much more difficult to deal with. Things totally unrelated to the war will get triggered and create. Despite this, Ukrainians continue on, fighting, praying, celebrating Easter, helping each other. In this context, everything you do is an act of resistance. Every day you wake up and continue on is an act of defiance that declares, I am looking past the end of this war, to a day when peace will return. The simplest of spiritual practices takes on a new significance and are transformed by their context. To me, the transformation of religious symbols, what I'm talking about, during wartime, is nowhere clearer than religious art, which is what I want to talk to you the rest of the time. If you ever walked into an Orthodox church, you'll notice immediately the walls are covered in icons, which is one of the most distinctive expressions of the Orthodox faith. So let me show you some icons which have been produced since the war. This is an artist named Alexander Flamenco. And he's holding up, I don't know if you can see it very well, in two ammo boxes. These are boxes of ammo for Kalashnikov rifles. In 2014, when Russia invaded in Donbass, he went to the front lines and saw these wooden boxes filled with bullets and decided to paint icons on them. Since then, he's launched a fundraising campaign titled Buy an Icon, Save a Life. So each of these icons sells for $2,000 to $4,000. In order to purchase one, you have to make a donation for that amount to a mobile hospital that has saved thousands of lives of Ukrainians. These icons have been exhibited in various galleries and other public spaces across Europe and America, bearing witness to the war. Here's, you can see on the left here is a traditional icon of Christ. It's called Made Without Human Hands. And then on the right is reinterpretation. I'm going to read to you what one Ukrainian scholar and peacemaker, Dr. Lydia Lotsova, has written about this icon. Quote, this face of Christ exposes the paradox of combining traditional Byzantine iconography with objects associated with war violence. The board, which is used for weaponry, is not hidden behind neat layers of varnish. The face that emerges on the wood bears traces of damage, cracks, remnants of metal. It is painted on an undecorated background without a hint of the image of the tower in the oldest version of the icon. The halo is not outlined, but is suggested by blue dashes on three sides of the head made with fingers. And instead of the traditional letters you see around the head, there are black spots burned with charcoal. The wood of the ammo box is reminiscent of the cross, the instruments of Christ's murder and the sign of his victory over death, which does not eliminate human vulnerability and the need for healing. This is the face of God who reveals himself magnificently decorated in church, but in specific historical circumstances, directly, simply, tangibly, turning death into life. Flamenco himself says of the icons, quote, most people think of this war as something far away. It's important for me to show people that the war is real, that this ammunition box is real, that it stored real weapons that killed real people, I don't want this war to exist. I don't want my icons to exist either. Here's another one of his. This is a very traditional image of St. George, the soldier saint, slaying a dragon. St. George is a very complicated saint in the Orthodox Church. He's often held up as the patron of soldiers, as a symbol of righteous Christian combat, the patron of many people, many soldiers going off to war. But the image is more subtle than that. If you notice how thin his lance is and how barely his hand grasps it, it indicates there's something a lot more going on here than the slaying of the beast. And if you read the actual original text for this, St. George doesn't slay the dragon with his lance. He pierces it, which tames it and befriends it. Still, that hasn't stopped people from using St. George as a symbol of violence. Since the days of the Russian Empire, the Order of St. George has been the highest military honor in Russia, and it is marked by the use of the orange and black St. George ribbon. You can see it here in its traditional form, as well as in the Russian sea, which has become so infamous in the last year. Nowadays, people in Russia wear the St. George ribbon as a sign of pro-military nationalism. Now here's an icon that I want to show you by Kiev artist Roman Solivashov. It's St. George, but the dragon he's killing is in the red or the orange and black colors of the St. George ribbon. Thus, this familiar icon of St. George has been transformed in this war context from a pro-militaryism to an anti-military image. The evil that St. George is slaying is the very idea of religiously inflected nationalism. The saint used by pro-war nationalists is here killing the idea of pro-war nationalists. St. George slays the St. George ribbon. Here's another version of St. George. Only this is part sculpture, part icon. The dragon is made from fragments of a Russian missile, marked with the letter Z. The artist is Kosko Markovich from Lviv. This same artist makes icons of the Archangel Michael and distributes them on the front line to soldiers. Many other icons produced since the invasion have focused on Mary, the Mother of God, known as the Theotokos in the Orthodox Church. Here is the Madonna of Azovstal by Maxim Polenko. This icon combines two traditional icons, one which called the Protection of the Mother of God, which depicts her with her arms stretched out and people under her protection, and another one titled The Joy of All Who Sorrow, which depicts her as surrounded by flowers. Here you can see the people of Ukraine under her cloak. It's maybe a little hard to see all the faces there. And the city on her dress. And the bombs transformed into flowers as they come to meet her. There's a very old tradition in the Orthodox Church. In our hymns, we call her the Defender General. This comes from an event in the summer of 626, where Constantinople was saved from enemy invasion, not by force of arms, but through the non-military, supposedly supernatural intervention of Mary. It was recorded that Emperor Heraclius and his army were away, and simultaneously the Scythians and the Persians attacked the city. So people began praying. They marched to the wall where there happened to be a church of Mary, and they prayed to Mary to save them. And soon after, a hurricane came and swept away all of the enemy forces. Since that time, in every October, the Orthodox Church celebrates the Feast of the Protection of the Mother of God. There's one Orthodox scholar, Dr. Marian Simeon, who has commented on this tradition by calling it the feminine defense paradigm, which he says deconstructs the masculinity of war, consistently skewing the meaning of violence away from physical expression. It's because of this tradition that the Orthodox Church has never developed a just war theory. The effect of such imagery over the Orthodox Byzantine society contributed to a sense of social cohesion, and such illustrations emphasize that violence leads to alienation, destroying God's own creation. Thus, within the spirituality of warfare, the feminine motif has been profound and complex, replacing such attitudes of aggression with those of reconciliation, maternal instincts, nurturing, and restoration. Here's another icon of Mary by Snežana Kapitanska, Kiev, called the Mary, Full Mother of God. On the left, you see the traditional icon, which is Mary of the Seven Swords. So there's a tradition that Mary suffered 7 sorrows, which are represented by swords because there's a verse saying, swords shall pierce her. And Snežana has replaced these swords with Russian missiles, labeled with a Z, and changed her garment from the traditional red to the Ukrainian gold and blue. And here's another icon titled, "The City is Gone, but the Sea of Azov Remains," by Ivanka Dimin, the wife of the priest I mentioned earlier in Maidan. And here finally is a Madonna that I quite love, by Natalia Pastuchenko. Dr. Lydia Lotsova comments on this one by saying, "Often iconographic imagery becomes a way to identify with the direct violence and trauma experience, especially in the work of female artists, as these all do." Another female artist, Inga Levy of Kiev, produced these 2 moving images from a series titled The Diary of War Double Exposure, which juxtaposes traditional icons in the foreground with images from the war. On the left is the entry to Jerusalem, Christ upon the donkey, mixed with Mariupol. On the right is the Last Supper, against a shot from a video of a Russian tank shooting at the residential quarters. Here, the identification is between the suffering of Ukrainians eating dinner in their own residential quarters with the suffering of Christ. Finally, I want to end with two more images of Christ, both from an icon workshop held last summer in Kiev in the midst of the war, titled Heaven on Earth. This first is called The Lament of Jesus Christ for Ukraine, which depicts Christ weeping over the invaded army in various scenes of destruction. Here, the suffering of Christ and the suffering of Ukrainians are again identified with each other. The second image I want to show from this workshop is called The Scourging of Christ, which is based on an old iconographic depiction of Christ's Passion. On the left, you see the traditional icon of the scourging, Roman soldiers with whips whipping Christ. On the right is an image that occurred last July. You see there's 2 different Orthodox churches in Ukraine, one that's independent, based in Kiev, one that's affiliated with Russia, based in Moscow. Here, a priest from Russia is rushing the stage to beat the Ukrainian priest with a cross. You can see the parallelism here. And so the image, called The Scourging of Christ, depicts Christ being whipped. On his left is Vladimir Putin. On his right is Patriarch Kirill of Moscow. And finally, to close, I now want to emphasize this theme a bit, the identification of Christ with the suffering of Ukraine. One of the priests that my organization has been funding is Father George Kovalenko, an amazing, incredible man who lives in Kiev. Father George runs an organization called God Against War. He's been heavily involved in peace efforts in Ukraine, conducting secret negotiations between the Ukrainian and the Moscow churches. He's aided in the evacuation of many people, personally driving them across the war-torn country to safety, at which point he turns around and drives back to Kiev. Last year, Father George wrote a reflection on the massacre in Bucha, titled, "Where Was God in Bucha?" As many of you know, I'm sure, last spring the news broke that more than 450 bodies had been found of men, women, and children, many of whom had their hands bound and were executed point blank. Some of the teenage girls showed signs of rape. They also found a torture chamber. Father George reflected on this, asking where was God? And his answer was, I think, captured by this image here. So, since I think it's important to end with a voice other than my own, I'm going to let the Ukrainian priest speak for himself here. So here's Father George's words. With the images that come to us from Bucha, the people close to me ask themselves the question, where was God? Why didn't he stop that? How could he allow it? It is very difficult for me to answer this question because words are not enough. Today, a priest told me that right now it's better to be silent. At this time, I think it's better to empathize, to stand with these people. It's better to cry with them and to ask the same questions, because these are the questions that David asks. When you read the Psalms, you hear the same cry, the same pain, the same question. When you read the book of Job, you hear the same thing. And it speaks to us today. But just because I can refer to these texts does not lessen the pain. And so I won't try to answer the question, and that cry and that pain, and the crying of our women, but I'll try to figure out for myself, which is the God that I believe in? Who is this God? Why is this happening now? And paradoxically, it is in the confession of my faith that I find the answer. I believe in a God who has become a man like others. They also wanted to kill him when he was still a newborn. Together with his family, he became a refugee. When he fled with his family, in the place from which he left, many infants were killed because it was he who they wanted. And then Christ came to people and preached to them, calling them to live according to the laws of God. But what did these people do? They betrayed him, imprisoned, bound, tortured, whipped, and finally nailed him to the cross, after which he died. I believe in a God who died on the cross, and it is a reality. It is the same reality as the deaths in Bucha, Mariupol, and other cities. Because God died there. God died in Bucha and Mariupol, as then he did on a cross. Because God became man, and the humanity of God became the church. And I believe now that God is these people representing his body who believe in him, who do no harm, who suffer and who are killed. He went through it all himself, and he feels that pain now. Likewise, his mother was a refugee, and she saw her son crucified, how he died, how he was taken down. Consequently, the Mother of God understands our women more, and the mother's grief more than I do. But why didn't God stop this? Precisely because it is the same God who created us free to choose between good and evil. It is a God who has given us this possibility. He is not an architect who created a machine in which everything is a cog, some kind of mechanism that controls everything. I believe that we choose what will happen. God knows what could, but it's we who make the choice. And in accordance with that choice, the good continues to fight and overcome evil. Because God is life, and life no matter what goes on, because it is love, and it is this love which wins. I believe God will help our cities, because Bucha, Irpin, Gostomel, Chernigov, and Konotop are now released. I believe that these cities will be resurrected, that the memory of these people who have gone to God, who not only died, but are also called to the resurrection, will live on. I believe in the resurrection of Christ. For God is not only dead, but has conquered death, has risen from the dead, and that means that life wins and love wins. We will live, do good, rebuild with our own hands, and with God's help, all that has been destroyed. Because what is happening is a divine human process. God and humanity cooperate, collaborate, filling in the world with life and love. And the evil resists that, trying to destroy, exterminate, and kill. But the good will win for sure. Today I read a message from my friend in which she believes there is no God. And in a way I agree with her. Because this feeling of abandonment by God is natural. It's described in the scriptures, in the book of Job, in the Psalms. David calls for the destruction of his enemies who attack him. He cries out for protection, does not understand why there is no God, why he does nothing. Christ himself on the cross in his last moments of life called to God, why have you forsaken me? Even God experiences the abandonment. And so it is a natural reaction of our people to ask these questions, to make such statements. And it is not the words that convince us, but the fact that we continue to live. to love each other, to support each other, to pray for each other. And we believe in a God who is among us, in us, with us, the God of love, the God of sacrifice. Our God is with us. He is with us even when it seems that he has left us. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nick, for a really wonderful, thought-provoking presentation. So we have a good amount of time, maybe 20 minutes or so, to ask questions of our presenters or just get into a conversation. So any questions, any thoughts that people would like to share at this point?
Thank you so much for this. Thank you for sharing the icons. I'm hoping you can, is it possible to share this with Patrick and give us some of these images?
Yes, Patrick has the slides. Welcome to share.
So my question is embodied in this last icon. And it's so troubling that the Moscow Orthodox Church is blessing the war, blessing the soldiers as they war, as they see it. And to me, that's so troubling. Can you comment on that later?
Yes, so I serve in the Moscow church. So this is torn my parish apart. It's torn a lot of our communities apart. One of the things my organization has done, so it's illegal in Russia to speak out against the war. It's illegal to call it a war. I like to use the word war. There are a number of priests inside Russia who have spoken out. There was a letter that was circulated. Some priests have come out publicly. A number of them have ended up in prison. And what we've done as an organization is we've raised funds for these Russian priests to evacuate them from the country, find them safe places to go. And then once they're safe, we've been publishing their underground writings in Telegram channels on our website. One of these priests gave a sermon the first weekend after the war began, condemning it, and his parishioners called the cops on him that week. He was arrested. Thankfully, he's safe now. But it's very tragic. It's very sad. The church in Russia takes very much cues from the state, and so it's very hard to be an independent speaker. And even people who don't speak out, there's the person who's directly under Kirill, one of the second highest ranked missions in the country, used to work with our organization, and is a pacifist. And he has said nothing about the war, just total silence, but he was still kicked out of his post because they knew that he would be a liability.
Other questions or comments?
Thank you so much for this. And the icons, or the ammo box icons, wow. That's an amazing thing to see. I'm not sure what to make of that. But I do have a question that seems to go to the heart of the class that I teach. And I don't know what the answer is, but I'd love to hear what you have to say. You mentioned the priests and the church in Moscow versus the priests in Ukraine. Which one is right, and how do they know? And how does this question redound to the question of how do we live together in a just world?
Thank you. I'm afraid I don't have any easy answers to these questions. I would say that there's two different levels to it. There's the official statements that come out, and one of my friends who's a peace activist in Ukraine says she feels completely abandoned at the official level. The church in Russia just puts out these awful propaganda statements. Patriarch Kirill just last month, or not last month, in September, in September said that soldiers who go and die in battle will be counted as martyrs. Their sins will be cleansed straight ahead, which is heretical in the Orthodox Church. So one of the things our organization did was publish a full account of the history of this. There was a council that ruled on that in the 11th century. So literal heresy coming out of Moscow, justifying the war. But she said, even of the Ukrainian church, most of the official statements are, our military or our guardian angels. We need to defend them and muster our strength. And, very nationalist. And she says neither of these address the actual issue, which is the trauma, the difficulty, the fear, the isolation, and no amount of pro-Russian nationalism or pro-Ukrainian nationalism will minister to that. And so at the official level, she thinks both churches have been failing. But then there's also the unofficial level. So there was, priests in Russia have been very clever in what they've done. There was one priest who maintained his position, but I remember it was the feast of the beheading of St. John the Baptist, which is something we celebrate in the Orthodox Church. And he came up, and normally instead of a long sermon, he was at a cathedral in Moscow, and said, St. John the Baptist was unafraid and spoke his mind, for that was killed. And some people today are so afraid they do not speak at all. And that was his sermon, which is a very subtle way to show this kind of resistance. There's another thing I quite like is there's people have started holding signs in protest inside Russia with dashes, and I forget how many dashes it is, but there's the famous verse, "Thou shalt not kill," that takes a certain number of characters in Russia, and so they have that number of dashes. They just hold the sign, like 6 dashes on it, as a kind of protest. And then with inside Ukraine, I quoted Father George Kovalenko, who has been conducting these secret underground meetings between the two churches, ministering to people in a very pastoral way, addressing them where they're needed. So it's very difficult. It's hard to know what to do, what's right and wrong. And at the official level, people do feel abandoned by the church. But I think unofficially, and that's what I try to talk about, there's so many small moments of people standing up and comforting each other. And that's where I find